In our lead story today, we turn to a geopolitical milestone that the entire world is watching: the establishment of a fragile but desperately needed ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. After 15 months of continuous fighting, the Israel-Hamas war appears to be on the cusp of a meaningful breakthrough. But how long any ceasefire can last and whether it can lead to a broader peace, it's a far harder question to answer. Now, before we launch into the events of the last week, we've got to give our usual disclaimer. Due to the latency period between the time when these episodes are written and the time when they're ready for publication, we're not going to account for the most recent developments in Gaza at the time of release. Instead, everything that we discuss is accurate up to 12:01 a.m. on Friday, January 17th, local time in Israel and Gaza. Anything that's happened after that will not be accounted for here, although depending on what's happened, we may discuss it in a future installment. That out of the way, let's dig in. The effort to reach a ceasefire in Gaza has been ongoing for many months, although it's only in the last few weeks that it seemed as if a resolution could actually be achieved. These have been long, painful negotiations where the mediator nation Qatar threatened a couple of months ago to pull out of the process because neither Israel nor Hamas were genuine in their intentions. But lately, the collapse of Assad's regime in Syria and Iran's abandonment of yet another one of its proxy partners now seems as if it was an eye-opening moment for the militant terror organization Hamas. After a series of long, intense talks in Qatar, mediated with additional support from Egypt and the United States, Hamas and the nation of Israel appeared close to terms by the end of the day on Tuesday the 14th, with Hamas ready, at least in theory, to agree once terms were finalized. Israeli officials confirmed that the talks had reached a critical moment as American representatives of President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump managed to present a unified enough front to advance the goals of Israel's most critical backer. Another key Gaza militant group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, attended via its own delegation, and as international pressure mounted on all sides to come to a deal, the following days would see a critical breakthrough. On January the 15th, a press conference from Doha revealed news that would echo around the world. On that day, Israel and Hamas agreed to the final terms of the ceasefire deal, pending confirmation by the Israeli government. Hamas doesn't engage in any meaningful representative governance and can thus speak for Gaza without having to pass anything by the review of its civil authorities. The terms of the deal, as mutually accepted in Doha, are for a three-phase ceasefire laid out as follows. The first phase will include a 6-week initial ceasefire, during which time Israeli forces will gradually withdraw from central Gaza and allow for displaced Palestinians to return to northern Gaza. Israel will allow a surge of humanitarian aid at a rate of 600 truckloads per day. Although the reasons for that specific figure were not laid out precisely, such a number would provide Gaza its estimated baseline need for aid, typically estimated at 500 trucks per day, plus additional volume to ship much-needed equipment and supplies to replace what's been exhausted, get extra food to those who need it, and allow for the gradual creation of a limited surplus. The aid shipments will include 50 fuel trucks per day and will see 300 trucks per day allocated to northern Gaza, where famine concerns are at their most acute. Then there's the matter of a hostage release. Over the course of the Phase 1 ceasefire, Hamas will release all women, children, and men over 50 that it's currently holding as hostages, including women soldiers. That'll be a total of 33 hostages at current count. Women and hostages under 19 will be released first, followed by men over 50. At least 3 Israeli hostages are expected to be released each week, although a higher rate of release during at least one of those weeks will be required to see Hamas fulfill its obligations. Living hostages will be released first, followed by the remains of hostages who've died in captivity. In exchange, Israel will release 30 Palestinian detainees for every civilian hostage that Hamas releases and 50 Palestinian detainees for every woman soldier that's released. By the end of the 6-week first phase, Israel is expected to release all Palestinian women and children, defined as people under the age of 19 who've been detained since October the 7th, 2023. Based on Israel's discretion and on who and when to release, anywhere from 990 to 1,650 Palestinian detainees could be released within the next 6 weeks. The deal is expected to be implemented with combined support from the US, Egypt, and Qatar, the 3 nations that have served as mediators in the whole negotiation process. Now, during the first 6-week ceasefire phase, Israel and Hamas are expected to negotiate a second phase extension. That extension should include the release of all remaining hostages by Hamas, including all Israeli men who are soldiers for the IDF. During that phase, Israel and Hamas are expected to negotiate a permanent ceasefire and the full withdrawal of Israeli soldiers from the Gaza Strip. During a second phase, negotiations will begin on the third and final ceasefire phase, expected to deal with the return of remains of deceased hostages and begin the process of Gazan reconstruction. If agreed by Israel, implementation of Phase 1 will begin on Sunday, January the 19th, meaning that you watching this episode can go check out whether it's actually implemented or not. Unfortunately, however, the immediate aftermath of the January 15th announcement has not been a smooth affair. On Thursday the 16th, reports emerged from the negotiation process that there was a sticking point left to be worked out relating to the specific identities of Palestinian prisoners that Hamas wanted to see released. Meanwhile, Israel delayed its expected cabinet meeting to ratify the ceasefire agreement, with that meeting scheduled for Friday the 18th as of the time of writing. In the day since the truce was unveiled, Israel launched a series of airstrikes across Gaza, killing a total of 77 people, according to Hamas-run Gazan civil authorities. Those strikes have stoked fears in Gaza that even if a ceasefire is agreed, Israel may take advantage of the pre-ceasefire period to rapidly escalate attacks. Also in Israel, far-right leader and security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has threatened to lead his party in resignation from Israel's coalition government if the deal goes through, adding intense political pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to appease Ben-Gvir, keep his government stable, and dodge corruption charges that are waiting for him when he eventually leaves his post as PM. Another far-right coalition party has made a similar threat, while a third has hinted that it may do the same. Despite those troubling signs, Hamas senior officials signaled that they were still committed to the ceasefire, while US leaders worked to signal composure and patience as outstanding problems were resolved. The latest indicators, at the time of writing, are that the issue around which Palestinian prisoners to release has been resolved, although that's not yet been formally announced. Meanwhile, Israel's political opposition has vowed to help the deal over the finish line, voting with the Prime Minister's party to make up for lost votes from the far right. They likely will not save him personally, however, if the far right abandons the coalition. By the time this episode goes out, the ceasefire will hopefully be in effect and will be holding, much as the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah has held thus far. Like the Hezbollah ceasefire, it's not unlikely that there may be minor flare-ups in violence over time, but just like that situation, there is a wide gap between intermittent, limited airstrikes or skirmishes and a full resumption of hostilities. With any luck, the situation in the Gaza Strip will be the former, or if the world gets really lucky, the ceasefire could even hold entirely. In the coming weeks, assuming that all goes well from here, a surge of aid into Gaza should alleviate famine conditions in the hardest-hit areas. Meanwhile, the influx of food, fuel, and other critical supplies will fundamentally disrupt the Gazan black market, where local gangs have taken to hoarding supplies and selling them off at exorbitant prices. After a few days of continuous deliveries, there should be too much aid for anyone to be hoarding it, hopefully causing a collapse among those gangs and getting food back into Gazans' mouths. And across the region, the ramifications of the ceasefire will be important to watch as they play out. One key factor is the Houthi rebel organization of Yemen, who've kept up their continual strikes on shipping in the Red Sea, as well as intermittent missile and drone attacks against Israel proper, as a stated measure of solidarity with the Hamas organization. Israel and the Houthis have been ratcheting up tensions recently, and this ceasefire will be a critical litmus test for both sides to evaluate and then show the world what their true intentions are. If the Houthis' only aim in their campaign has been to support Hamas and Gaza, then a ceasefire should put a stop to their attacks, whereas if Israel's only been engaged in its air campaign in Israel to deter the Houthis, then that air campaign should stop once the Houthi attacks die out. But if either side is pursuing another, broader goal right now in their shared hostilities, or if either of them have shifted their strategic assessments to regard each other as a major threat outside the context of Gaza, then a telltale sign of that change will be that their strikes may continue or even intensify. Israel, in particular, may take advantage of the ceasefire in Gaza to turn and squish the last remaining Iranian proxy force, the Houthis, who it hasn't either dealt with in battle or watched come toppling down in the last year. But it's also an opportunity for Israel to think carefully about its path forward with the Houthis, an organization that even former high-ranking Israeli officials admit hasn't been deeply penetrated like other organizations such as Hezbollah or the Iranian government. Meanwhile, a Hamas ceasefire should diffuse any lingering pressure in Iran to take military action toward Israel, although that's already an unlikely possibility given Israel's successful destruction of most of Iran's air defenses a few months ago. A far more potent stumbling block, however, comes in the way that the ceasefire is meant to be extended. It's not a surprise that the international community, specifically the three mediator nations involved with the ceasefire process, opted to establish and implement a first-phase ceasefire as early as possible. trying to establish a complete multi-stage process and have it mutually agreed before stopping the fighting at all just would have prolonged the violence and introduced more points of potential failure. But implementing a first-stage deal with a clear 6-week deadline without having a follow-up plan in place leaves the very obvious possibility of a return to violence once this first-stage deal expires. If Hamas and Israel can't come to terms over the next 6 weeks of negotiations, then neither side will have agreed to any provisions that would stop a subsequent return to violence. That's not to say that reaching the 6-week benchmark would automatically restart the war. If Israel and Hamas are mutually engaged in a productive set of negotiations to reach a second-stage ceasefire deal and simply need more time to work out the details, then the first-stage ceasefire could simply be lengthened, or both sides could keep their people in check for however long it takes to find a resolution. But in the event that the next several weeks don't go smoothly, again, assuming that a ceasefire is agreed or imminent by the time this episode is published, then this may ultimately be a brief respite for both sides to catch their breath before returning to all-out war. It's happened before, in this very conflict, the last time that Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire and hostage exchange. And if the situation is deteriorating within a few weeks, then it sets up a potentially major game of chicken. In the event that both sides know that fighting will resume once the ceasefire ends, then they'll each be incentivized to consider preemptive action and break the ceasefire early in order to gain the element of surprise and take early initiative in a round of fighting that they understand is coming anyway. Somebody's got to go first. Both sides are worried that the other will go first, and each of them considers making their move even sooner than they otherwise might. In short, even once a ceasefire is formally agreed, the Gaza Strip is still very much a powder keg for the foreseeable future. Questions of reconstruction, quite frankly, are premature. Although, if you missed it, we did discuss the UAE's potential role leading a post-war Gaza on a Situation episode that we published on January 13th. Check that out if you'd like a window into how Gaza reconstruction could look, and with any luck, if this ceasefire holds, we'll be revisiting that question in the near future. Next up, we turn to the nation of Libya, where in a quiet shifting of geopolitical fortunes, the balance of power in the country is showing signs of imminent change. It's not a direct result of any major action in Libya, no upheaval, no resignation by a leader, nothing like that. Instead, it's the rippling ramifications of Syria's collapse that have led Libya, the Arab Spring's other most tragic story, to a turning point. We'll start with a report by the Centre for European Policy Analysis, better known as CEPA, that came out on January the 9th of this year. The report provides an accounting of military travel in and out of Syria by the forces of Russia, who've backed one of Libya's two dueling factions, the Eastern Tobruk-based faction under the de facto leadership of General Khalifa Haftar. For years, Haftar has received Russian support via military shipments and mercenaries, but for Russia, the fall of its close ally Bashar al-Assad in Syria presents a major problem. Moscow runs a network of military and economic influence all across Africa, including in Libya, but relies on a fragile connective chain in order to do it. Supplies and personnel come from Moscow, they refuel their planes or load onto ships at two major bases in Syria, and then they head south to Libya, either as a final destination or on their journey toward the Sahel or sub-Saharan Africa. But that connective chain is no longer reliable, with Russia's Syrian bases no longer under the protection of Assad and with a new administration in Damascus. That administration can well order those bases to shut down, allow Western assets in to spy or sabotage, or even launch an outright attack to drive Russian forces out. This new change has put Russian operations across Africa in peril, and a recent uptick in Russian traffic in and out of Libya appears to be a direct result of that. According to flight trackers examined by CEPA, Russian military transport aircraft have been making daily visits in and out of 3 airbases in Libya, with Russia's key airbase in Syria as their point of departure and return. Meanwhile, 4 Russian naval transports have made the journey from Russia across the Mediterranean to eastern Libya, Haftar country, in what's likely a ferrying operation for heavy military equipment. Not all the ships made the journey successfully. One made headlines when it blew up and sank not long after crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. But another switched off its transponder for 4 days while in the vicinity of the Libyan coast before joining the other ships and continuing travel towards Syria. Neither the movement of the ships nor the aircraft come with a clear explanation, but the conclusion that CEPA drew from its observations is that Russia is looking to ramp up its involvement in Libya. Now here at WarFronts, we'll add an extra layer of interpretation, that Russia may be in the process of shifting its operations to be less reliant on Syria and perhaps in the long run to relocate its gateway to Africa operations under the protection of friendly partners in Libya. Tobruk is not much further from Moscow than Damascus is, and it's located in a nation where the government that opposes Haftar is known to be weak and not expected to get stronger. It's within range of the same transport aircraft that Russia uses to get to Syria, particularly the Ilyushin IL-76, and it's just as accessible through the Mediterranean as Syria. On top of the recent transport operations to Libya, Seba points out that Russia is in the process of gaining permission to build a naval base on Libyan soil. That's a process that's been underway for 2 years now, largely carried out by Russia's Deputy Minister of Defense, Yunusbek Yevkarov. Libya's internationally recognized leadership in Tripoli has been pushing back against Russia for a while now, trying to keep the nation from expanding its military footprint there. But it's likely to face far more pressure under the table now that rebasing its Africa forces are a top priority for Moscow. The Prime Minister in Tripoli has insisted that his government would not allow Russian weapons to enter the nation, but in reality, his powers to stop such a thing are somewhere between limited and non-existent. Even with a warm water port not currently approved, Russia appears to be flooding troops and equipment into a base called Martin al-Sarraj near Libya's southern border with Chad and Sudan, easily granting access to both nations as well as Mali and Burkina Faso. Former forces of the Syrian army are believed to be assisting them with the restoration of that base as it's built into a logistical center. But simply saying that Libya is about to become Russia's newest outright puppet in the Mediterranean is far too simplistic of a telling to really represent what's happening here. There are real incentives for Haftar as well as the Tripoli government to resist a stepped-up presence from Moscow, partly because Haftar wants to keep up relatively positive relations with the US and Europe, partly because he's a US citizen and may fear his assets being frozen, and partly because Russia just proved at Bashar al-Assad's expense that having Vladimir Putin as a friend isn't all it's cracked up to be. In fact, the situation in Libya isn't an incoming wave of Russification, but a battle for influence between Russia and the very nation that saw Moscow's interests booted out of Syria, Turkey. Turkey has been substantively involved in Libya for about half a decade now, after signing a maritime pact with the nation back in 2019 in order to make itself a more important player in the Med. A January 13th report by the Atlantic Council explains that Turkey has a, quote, broader vision of Libya and Syria as interconnected pillars of its geopolitical strategy in the Mediterranean, where actions in one arena bolster its influence in the other. In the early days of 2025, Turkey's recent actions in the Syrian arena would have thus massively bolstered its influence in Libya, and that appears to be precisely what's happened. Turkey's relationship with Russia isn't a rivalry exactly, but it's certainly a balancing act where Turkey would rather not see its influence outweighed by Russia. As we speak, Turkey is working to put in place the same maritime arrangements in and around Syria as it's had in Libya for years, forming a sort of sea bridge between the two nations that's under Turkey's control and beholden to Turkey's influence. That's a potentially concerning situation for Russia, a nation that already has to send new ships to the Mediterranean either via the Strait of Gibraltar or the Bosporus Strait from the Black Sea, with the latter being entirely under Turkey's control. Making a play for Syria, while maintaining its hold on Libya, would mean that Turkey can counteract Russian influence everywhere it exists in the Mediterranean, potentially working to collaborative ends or potentially snuffing out Russian influence in the region if it wishes. The threat of a power grab from Turkey of that kind isn't a today problem for Russia, but nor is it a can that Russia can kick too far down the road. Turkey badly wants to strengthen its influence in the Mediterranean, it's building up major diplomatic and military leverage around the Mediterranean coast, and it's working to keep the cautious trust of its NATO allies, something that it would risk if it were to cozy up too closely with Moscow. If Turkey's eye is on the Mediterranean, then when Turkey is in a position to choose between Moscow and Brussels, it would be a fool to choose Brussels, seeing as, for all intents and purposes, the Mediterranean is NATO's little pond in a strategic sense. And if Turkey can optimize its Mediterranean holdings to make sure it keeps those holdings while credibly siding with NATO, if it ever has to, then the convenient byproduct of that strategic arrangement is that it becomes Russia's gatekeeper to the Mediterranean. Assuming that position, and Turkey will by default pick up an even more powerful position along with it, Russia's gatekeeper in Africa. Of course, while we certainly don't lend much praise to Russia's ability to, say, maintain a supply line long enough to take over Kiev, we do have to emphasize that the Kremlin is keenly strategically aware when it puts its collective mind to a task. Given how much of a priority Africa is for Russia, Turkey's potential to balance Russia in both Libya and Syria has got to be on Vladimir Putin's mind, and having its African interests beholden to the goodwill of a NATO nation is an outcome that Russia would very obviously like to avoid. Indeed, the dynamic taking shape in Libya right now, and Syria along with it, isn't necessarily one that introduces a new flashpoint to either nation. Both Moscow and Ankara have little intention to start a hot war of any kind with each other for a very, very, very long list of reasons. But it is a showdown nonetheless in a Mediterranean arena where Moscow may quickly be realizing that it's been outplayed by a rival in Turkey that's been much more focused on the region than Russia ever has been. Right now, Russia's ambitions in Africa are more important to Moscow than they have ever been, and maintaining a bridge to the continent is going to be of utmost importance, especially in the years after the current Ukraine conflict ends. But all of Russia's African ambitions now rest in Turkey's outstretched hand, and whether Turkey decides to hold those ambitions carefully or squeeze is entirely Turkey's decision. That's not to say that Turkey's own situation's rock solid. In the diplomatic sphere, it gets as far as it does, largely because of its alliances with Europe and the US and its ability to throw around clout as a result. That, in turn, is a byproduct of Europe and America's frequent willingness to look the other way when Ankara's doing its thing. If that dynamic were to shift, Turkey's Mediterranean interests could quickly be compromised by Russia, Israel, or even factions within Libya and Syria. But even if Turkey's grip on the Mediterranean is precarious, it's a hell of a lot more firm than Russia's at a moment when incoming US President Donald Trump has shown a clear preference to encourage Turkish ambition, and when Russia is remaining in Turkish-influenced Syria, basically by invitation. Perhaps by consolidating and broadening its presence in Libya, Russia can ensure that it can continue standing up to Turkey in the region, or perhaps it's already too late. As always, time is gonna tell. It's often said that a week is a long time in politics, and if that's true, then the nearly 7 weeks that have passed since South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law could well be classified as a political lifetime. Perhaps nowhere was this better summed up than in the events of last Wednesday. Starting in the early hours, over 1,000 officers, including those usually involved in the arrest of gangland figures, descended on the presidential compound in Seoul. After scaling obstacles and cutting through barbed wire, they were finally able to serve an arrest warrant that Yoon had refused to recognize. And so it was that the man who tried to overthrow South Korean democracy on December the 3rd found himself on January 15th hunkering down to sleep in a sparse cell in Seoul Detention Center. Here's how the Washington Post summed up the conditions. Cold cereal and a blanket on the floor, how South Korea is holding a president. But while this might sound like the ignominious end of a man who threw his nation into chaos, the reality is that the country's crisis is far from over. Rather than strengthen democracy, the martial law saga now appears to be deepening what are already some vast divisions. The blame for a lot of this can be laid at the feet of Yoon himself. When 100 officers from the Corruption Investigation Office initially went to arrest him on January 3rd, they were confronted by twice as many men from the Presidential Protection Service who refused to let them in. The result was a 6-hour standoff, followed by a humiliating climb down for the CIO. According to liberal South Korean newspaper Hankyoreh, Yoon had been planning an even more decisive victory on Wednesday. Citing unnamed sources, their article claimed that, quote, Yoon had directed service officials during a lunch on Sunday to consider using force in the event of a second detention warrant execution attempt. In the end, that use of force seems to have boiled down in practice to a brief, minor scuffle that mildly injured one participant. The rest of the PPS seems to have stood down without a fight, likely due to warnings that they themselves could be arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. Still, the fact Yoon even considered using force to shield himself from a lawfully issued arrest warrant is shocking. Although, it's all part of a piece with how he behaved during the 6 hours martial law was in effect. As you may recall from our previous video, Yoon's decree was voted down over the night of December the 3rd by a quorum of politicians who managed to fight their way into the National Assembly. During the vote, the president is now known to have ordered the military to break into the assembly building and drag members out, and we're quoting here, by shooting if necessary. First Deputy Director of the National Intelligence Service, Hong Jang-wong, has likewise testified that Yoon ordered him to arrest politicians, judges, and media figures critical of the government. Elsewhere, former head of the Asia program at Chatham House, John Nelson Wright, has claimed in an essay that, quote, plans were afoot to incarcerate hundreds of politicians in facilities outside Seoul. If that sounds extreme, it has nothing on the allegations made by lawmaker Park Byung-kai of the opposition Democratic Party, who has gone on record saying a military source told him that the defense minister had tried to engineer a border skirmish with North Korea as a pretext for imposing martial law. A skirmish that could have easily escalated into a full-blown conflict that, as we pointed out previously, the United States would have been treaty-bound to intervene in. So, when we say that Yoon is responsible for deepening his nation's political crisis, we're not just throwing out opinions. It's absolutely on par for his personality, one forged in a combative prosecutorial career in which compromise was seen as a weakness. Indeed, Yoon was at it again the day he was arrested. Writing on Facebook, he peddled conspiracy theories about the April elections in which the opposition won a hefty majority. In a political culture as combustible as South Korea's, that was the equivalent of sauntering up to a rickety building, stood in a pool of gasoline, and flicking a cigarette butt onto it. Yet, the deeper story of this crisis isn't that Yoon is willing to put his own interest above that of the nation. It's that Korean society is now so polarized that he thought he could get away with it. In a sentence that will sound wearily familiar to many of our viewers, South Korea has seen an explosion in recent years of hyper-partisan, deeply conspiracy-minded content on social media. Content that depicts anyone on the other side as not just opponents, but liars, frauds, and just plain old evil. Hence why Yoon felt so comfortable calling the opposition Democratic Party criminals and traitors and accusing them of being bed with North Korea. Hence too why Yoon's popularity actually increased following the martial law crisis. But we'd be lying if we said that Yoon and his People Power Party were the only ones indulging in extreme partisanship. As John Nelson Wright wrote for Engelsberg Ideas, the opposition in South Korea is not blameless. The left has also embraced some of the uncompromising tone and Manichean logic of its conservative opponents. As evidence, he highlighted former President Moon obliquely referring to the conservatives as deep-rooted evils and the Democratic Party's heavy use of impeachment proceedings to remove prosecutors, auditors, and anyone trying to enact the PPP's proposed budget. This culminated with the removal of acting President Han Duck-seo on December 27th in a simple majority vote, rather than the 2/3 usually required for removing a president. Now, the DP had good reasons for removing Han, who refused to confirm judges to the understaffed Constitutional Court tasked with examining Yoon's impeachment. But that doesn't mean it didn't still crank up tensions. As in any hyperpartisan environment, it's not just what one side does, but the ways the opposing sides feed off and react to perceived unfair behavior by the other, creating what we're going to call a democracy doom loop. The results of this are already clear to see in South Korean society, not just in the dueling street protest movements between supporters and opponents of Yoon, but also in the fragmenting of the bipartisan consensus that declaring martial law was an act deserving punishment. Still, the greater problem might not be the impact on South Korean society, but the way the crisis could embolden Seoul's enemies, and that could have ramifications for the Western-led security alliance in the Pacific. The most immediate impact is likely to be the blowing up of the anti-China alliance between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo that's been growing in strength since mid-2023. Now, we don't have time to get into all of the historical beef between Japan and South Korea, but the short version is that Tokyo's history of colonialism and wartime forced labor on the peninsula has left deep and bitter feelings. At one point in the last decade, Japan's then leader Shinzo Abe was even seen less favorably among South Koreans than Kim Jong-un. So while an alliance between Seoul and Tokyo to help combat the mutual threat from Beijing might seem common sense, the reality is that cementing that alliance took considerable work. And it was predicated in part on President Yoon being far more pragmatic in his foreign policy than many other South Korean politicians. For this pragmatism, leading lights in the Democratic Party labeled him a pro-Japanese traitor. The likely removal of Yoon as president then suggests relations with Japan might sink back into the mire, and you better believe that China is ready and waiting to exploit any divisions. Already there are reports that Beijing might be hoping to use the chaos caused by the martial law crisis to expand its presence in South Korean ocean territory that it lays claim to as its own. Local paper, the Chosun Ilbo, was quoted by broadcaster DW as saying, quote, "China aims to advance its claims to the ocean territory amid South Korea's political crisis." Of course, China isn't the only authoritarian regime likely to be pleased by the crisis in Seoul. Just over the border, North Korea, already emboldened by its new friendship with Russia, is likely to be looking at ways to exploit the fissures in society. In other words, allowing Yoon to get away with his attempt to declare martial law would have shattered South Korean society. But removing him may eliminate the country's greatest proponent of military cooperation with neighbors like Japan. As so often in these episodes, we'll have to wait and see how this saga ultimately plays out. For now, though, all eyes are on what will happen to Yoon. As we write this, the 48-hour deadline for holding the president has been paused due to legal challenges. That means we'll likely only find out if he's been set free or detained under a warrant in the time between us recording this and you watching it. As such, we're hesitant to speculate on how this will play out, although, as of late Thursday, not looking good for Yoon, is it? Perhaps the bigger issue, though, is how South Korea has experienced this destabilizing crisis. Just at the moment, its enemies are growing in confidence. Yoon's martial law declaration may have ultimately been the call of one egotistical man, but its aftershocks could impact the lives of millions of his countrymen. Thank you for watching.